You are nothing without me! This divorce leaves you with penniless ruin.
I am the sole heiress to the royal estate, and I have just bought your entire life.
Orchestrated, ambitious creative writing project spanning multiple narrative sections. Orchestrated, ambitious creative writing project spanning multiple narrative sections. Ethan Crawford smiled as he slid the divorce papers across the white tablecloth, right past the untouched anniversary cake, right past the candles still burning between them. "Sign it tonight," he said, not bothering to lower his voice while Celine draped herself over his shoulder. "You were never going to be enough for the life I built, Vivian. Take the check. Disappear." 5 years of marriage, gone in the time it took a waiter to refill a wine glass. Vivian Ashford did not cry. She picked up the pen. And somewhere in that quiet, devastating calm, Ethan had no idea he had just signed away everything he would ever have. If you're watching this story right now, hit like and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The Hudson Grand Ballroom had been rented for the occasion of Ethan and Vivian Crawford's 5th wedding anniversary, though by 9 o'clock that evening, most of the 200 guests had already begun to suspect that something about the night didn't sit right. It wasn't anything anyone could point to directly. It was the way Ethan kept checking his watch even as the orchestra played. It was the way his assistant, a nervous young man named Curtis, kept hovering near the side entrance with a leather folder pressed against his chest like he was guarding a bomb. It was the way Celine Marchetti, tall, blonde, wrapped in a red dress that cost more than most people's rent, kept drifting in and out of the crowd, never quite leaving Ethan's orbit, never quite explained. Vivian Ashford Crawford sat at the head table in pale blue silk, her dark hair pinned simply at the nape of her neck, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't wearing much jewelry. She never did. A thin gold bracelet, a pair of small pearl earrings that had been a gift from her mother years ago, back when her mother still called her by a name that no one in this room had ever heard. To anyone watching, she looked like exactly what they assumed her to be, a quiet woman, soft-spoken, the kind of wife who arranged flowers for a living and didn't say much at dinner parties. She owned a small flower shop on the Lower East Side called Ashford and Company, and most of Ethan's business associates had long ago decided she was sweet but unremarkable, the kind of woman a man married when he was young and unsure of himself, before he became someone important. What none of them knew, what not even Ethan fully understood, not anymore, not after 5 years of barely looking at her, was that Vivian Ashford had a name nobody at this table could pronounce correctly on the first try. Her real name, the one carved into a christening record in a small mountain kingdom most Americans couldn't find on a map, was Vivian Adelaide Ashford von Aurelia, Crown Princess of Aurelia, third in line once, before circumstances made her first. She had walked away from that life 8 years ago, not out of rebellion, not out of some dramatic falling out with her family, but because she had wanted, desperately, achingly wanted, to know what it felt like to be loved for nothing but herself. No titles, no security detail trailing 3 steps behind her, no men who smiled at her because of what her last name could do for their balance sheets. She had thought she'd found that with Ethan. She had been wrong. "You look like you're somewhere else tonight," said Marion, Vivian's closest friend and the only other person in the room who knew the truth about who Vivian really was. Marion had been Vivian's lady's companion once, years ago, before they'd both decided to play ordinary American women for a while. Marion ran a small accounting practice now, 2 blocks from the flower shop. She leaned in close, her voice pitched low beneath the music. "Vivian? What's wrong?" "Nothing," Vivian said. "I'm fine." "You've been holding that water glass for 10 minutes like it's about to run away from you." Vivian set the glass down. She forced something that resembled a smile. "I just have a strange feeling tonight, that's all." Across the room, Ethan was laughing too loudly at something one of his board members said, his hand resting just a little too long on Celine's lower back as she passed behind his chair. He thought no one noticed these things. He had always assumed Vivian was too gentle, too unobservant, too in love with him to notice the way his attention had drifted these past 8 months. The late nights at the office that smelled faintly of perfume that wasn't hers. The phone he now kept face down on every surface. The way he'd stopped reaching for her hand in public. She had noticed everything. She simply hadn't decided yet what to do about it. Ethan Crawford was 41 years old and the chief executive of Crawford Logistics International, a shipping and freight empire his father had built from 3 trucks and a warehouse in Newark 50 years earlier. Ethan had spent the last decade expanding it, too aggressively, some said, though no one said it to his face, into international ports, customs brokerage, even a failed venture into cargo airlines that had nearly sunk the company 2 years back. From the outside, Crawford Logistics looked like a titan. Forbes had run a piece on Ethan just last spring, a glossy photo of him standing in front of a container ship with his arms crossed, the headline calling him the man who moves the world. What Forbes hadn't printed, because Ethan had made very sure no one outside his finance department knew, was that Crawford Logistics was drowning in debt. 3 failed acquisitions, a $600 million credit line he'd personally guaranteed against company assets that were worth less than half what the banks believed, a board growing restless, a reputation built on appearances that were thinner than anyone suspected. Ethan needed something big. He needed it badly. And tonight, in the middle of his own anniversary party, he had decided the fastest way to free up capital, and free himself, frankly, from a marriage that had stopped serving any purpose he could identify, was to end things with the wife who'd never once asked him for anything. He found Curtis near the bar at 9:15. "Is it ready?" Curtis's throat moved as he swallowed. "Mr. Crawford, are you sure you want to do this here? Tonight? In front of—" "I didn't ask for your opinion." Ethan straightened his jacket. "I asked if it's ready." Curtis handed him the folder. Inside were the divorce papers, already drafted by Ethan's lawyer, already signed on Ethan's side. All that remained was Vivian's signature, and Ethan, full of the particular arrogance of a man who has never once in his adult life been told no by someone he considered beneath him, fully expected she would give it without complaint. She always did. He walked back across the ballroom floor with the folder tucked under his arm, the string quartet shifting into something slower, more sentimental, as if the universe itself were trying to give the room one last moment of grace before everything broke apart. He stopped in front of the head table. Celine drifted up behind him, close enough that her perfume reached Vivian before Ethan's voice did. "Vivian." He said her name like he was calling a waiter over. "I need a moment." The orchestra kept playing. A few heads turned, curious, the way people always turn when they sense a shift in the air before they understand why. "Of course," Vivian said, rising from her chair with the same quiet composure she brought to everything. She smoothed her dress. "Should we step outside?" "No." Ethan opened the folder and set it on the table, directly in front of her plate, directly beside the small white cake with its 5 candles still burning, one for each year. "Right here is fine." Marian's hand found Vivian's wrist beneath the table. Vivian didn't move. "What is this?" Vivian asked, though her eyes had already found the words at the top of the page. "Petition for dissolution of marriage." "It's time we were honest with each other," Ethan said. He didn't lower his voice. If anything, he seemed to want the room to hear, the way a man wants an audience when he believes he's about to win something. "We both know this marriage stopped working a long time ago. You've never really fit into this world, Vivian. The flower shop, the quiet little life. It was charming once. It isn't anymore." Vivian said nothing. Her face had gone very still, the kind of stillness that, to anyone who knew anything about Aurelian royal training, would have been instantly recognizable as the composure drilled into every member of that family since childhood. The same composure her grandmother had taught her, the one that meant never let them see what you're feeling, especially when what you're feeling could destroy them. But the guests at Hudson Grand didn't know that. To them, she just looked like a woman who'd been blindsided in front of 200 people. "Ethan," Marian said sharply, half rising. "Not here. Whatever this is—" "Sit down, Marian. This doesn't concern you." Ethan's eyes never left Vivian's face. There was something almost gleeful in them now, the look of a man who has rehearsed a moment and is finally getting to perform it. "I've had my legal team prepare a generous settlement, $200,000. The shop you can keep, though frankly, I don't know how you'll afford the lease without my name attached to the building. All I'm asking is that you sign tonight, quietly, and we handle the rest through lawyers." He glanced, almost involuntarily, towards Celine, who had not bothered to hide the small, satisfied smile pulling at her mouth. I think we both know it's time to be honest about what this marriage actually was. And what was it, Ethan? Vivian's voice was soft. Not weak. Soft the way a blade is soft right before it isn't. A mistake I made when I was young and stupid and thought love was supposed to feel like comfort instead of ambition. Ethan said it flatly, like he'd practiced the line in a mirror. You were sweet, Vivian. You still are. But sweet isn't enough to stand beside a man building something this big. I need someone who understands the world I live in now. Somewhere behind him, a guest at the next table, an older woman in a green gown, one of Ethan's investors' wives, gasped audibly and reached for her husband's arm. Vivian looked down at the papers. Then she looked at Celine, who met her gaze without flinching, without an ounce of shame, her chin tilted up in open triumph. And this was the part that would haunt Ethan Crawford for the rest of his life, the part he would replay at 3 a.m. months later when everything had already fallen apart around him. Vivian smiled. It wasn't a bitter smile. It wasn't broken or trembling. It was calm, almost amused, the smile of a woman who has just been handed exactly the permission she didn't know she was waiting for. You don't need to explain yourself to me, Ethan, she said. I understand perfectly. She picked up the pen from where it sat clipped to the folder. The room had gone fully silent now, the orchestra faltering into an uneasy hush, as the musicians too realized something was happening that didn't belong in the score they'd been hired to play. 200 sets of eyes watched as Vivian Ashford signed her name to the bottom of the page in handwriting, so steady it didn't waver once. She closed the folder and slid it back across the table to him. There, she said, you have what you asked for. Ethan blinked, caught off guard, as though he'd expected tears, pleading, some scene he could point to later as proof he'd done the kind thing by cutting her loose gently. Instead, he got silence and a steady hand, and something about that unsettled him more than crying would have. That's it? He said. No questions? No? What would I ask you, Ethan? Vivian tilted her head slightly. You've already told me everything I need to know. She reached for her small clutch on the table, opened it, and withdrew a thin gold compact. Not to check her makeup, but simply to have something to do with her hands while the room watched her, while Celine watched her, while her husband of 5 years stood there with the folder in his hand, looking for the first time that night, slightly unsure of himself. Vivian, Marian whispered, gripping her arm now. What are you doing? Don't just... It's all right, Marian. Vivian's voice was barely above a murmur, meant only for her friend. It's time. She rose from the table fully now, smoothing the front of her dress with both hands, and for one long moment she looked at Ethan, really looked at him, the way you look at someone for the last time when you've finally stopped hoping they'll become someone different. Thank you for the settlement offer, she said, loud enough now for the surrounding tables to hear. But I won't be needing it. Ethan frowned. Excuse me? The $200,000, keep it. You'll need it more than I will, I think. A faint, almost pitying smile crossed her face. Good night, Ethan. Good night, Celine. She nodded politely at the woman who'd spent the last 8 months in her husband's bed as though she were simply another acquaintance leaving a party early. Congratulations, I suppose. And then she walked out of the Hudson Grand Ballroom in her pale blue silk dress, her chin level, her steps unhurried, while 200 guests sat in stunned silence, and the string quartet, uncertain what else to do, began playing again. Badly, off-tempo, no one quite able to find the rhythm they'd lost. Tot. Outside, the August night was warm and close, the city humming with its usual restless energy. Marian caught up with her at the curb, breathless, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Vivian! Vivian, wait! Marian grabbed her shoulder, turned her around. In the streetlight, she finally saw it. Not tears, but something colder and more dangerous than tears. A kind of stillness Marian hadn't seen on Vivian's face in 8 years, not since the week before they'd both left Aurelia. Talk to me. What just happened in there? What needed to happen, Vivian said. He humiliated you in front of 200 people. He humiliated himself. Vivian pulled her phone from her clutch, her hands finally, only now, only here, away from his eyes, trembling slightly as she unlocked the screen. He just doesn't know it yet. Marion stared at her. What are you doing? Making a call I should have made 8 years ago when I decided to disappear. Vivian scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she hadn't dialed in 3 years. A name saved simply as G. Aurelia. It's time to go home, Marion. Home? Marion's voice cracked slightly. Vivian, you can't be serious. After everything you did to get away from... I left because I wanted to find out if anyone could ever love me without knowing what I was worth on paper. Vivian's thumb hovered over the call button. Behind her, faintly, through the ballroom's tall windows, she could still see the glow of candlelight, could still hear the distorted echo of music starting and stopping. I found my answer tonight. It just took 5 years longer than it should have. She pressed call. The line rang twice before a deep, formal voice answered, thick with an accent that didn't belong to this city, this country, this life she had been pretending to live. Your Highness, we did not expect to hear from you tonight. Marion's mouth fell open. She had known, of course, she had always known what Vivian really was. But hearing the title spoken aloud, here, on a sidewalk in Manhattan, with car horns blaring 2 blocks away, made it suddenly, dizzyingly real in a way it hadn't been in years. Gerard, Vivian said, and her voice had changed too, steadier now, carrying an authority Marion had never once heard her use in 8 years of friendship. I need the jet ready by morning, and I need you to begin pulling everything we have on Crawford Logistics International. Every contract, every debt, every shipping route, every overextended loan. I want to know exactly how much trouble that company is in before I land. There was a pause on the other end of the line, brief but heavy. May I ask what's happened, Your Highness? Vivian looked back toward the ballroom one last time, at the warm gold light spilling from those tall windows, at the life she was about to walk away from for the second time. Except this time, she understood, she wasn't running from anything. She was simply done pretending she had ever needed to. My husband just ended our marriage in front of 200 witnesses, she said calmly, because he decided I wasn't good enough to stand beside the empire he's built. She paused, and something in her voice sharpened into a tone Marion had never heard from her before. Not cruelty exactly, but a clean, cold clarity, the voice of someone who had just stopped holding back. He has no idea what that empire is actually worth. I'd like to be the one who shows him. Understood, Your Highness. The jet will be ready at dawn. She ended the call and stood for a moment on the sidewalk, the city moving around her, indifferent to the fact that an entire life had just quietly ended and another had just as quietly begun. Vivian, Marion said softly, are you sure about this? For the first time since they'd walked out of that ballroom, Vivian let herself breathe, really breathe, the way she hadn't in 5 years of small rooms and small expectations and a husband who had never once asked who she truly was before he decided he was done with her. I spent 5 years trying to make him love the version of me that fit into a flower shop on the Lower East Side, she said. I'm done shrinking myself for a man who never once bothered to ask what I was hiding. She looked up at the dark sky, at the few stars stubborn enough to push through the city's glow. Let's go home, Marion. There's a country waiting for me, and there's a man who has no idea what he's about to lose. Inside the ballroom, Ethan Crawford stood with the signed folder still in his hand, watching the door swing shut behind his now former wife, and felt, despite everything, an odd flicker of unease move through his chest, gone almost as quickly as it arrived. Buried beneath the champagne Curtis was already pressing back into his hand, beneath Celine's arm, sliding around his shoulders from behind, beneath the murmured congratulations of board members eager to flatter the man who still controlled their bonuses. Well, Celine said against his ear, her voice warm with satisfaction, that went easier than I expected. She always was easy, Ethan said, and laughed, though the sound came out a little hollower than he intended. He set the folder down on the table, beside the cake, with its 5 candles still burning, and didn't think to notice, that his hand wasn't quite steady when he reached for his glass. He told himself it was nothing. A flicker of guilt, maybe. The kind any decent man feels for one passing moment before remembering all the reasons his decision had been the right one. He had no way of knowing, standing there in his $5,000 suit beneath the gold light of a ballroom he'd rented to celebrate a marriage he'd just publicly destroyed, that somewhere over the Atlantic before sunrise, a private jet bearing the crest of the Kingdom of Aurelia would lift off from Teterboro carrying the woman he'd just called not enough, and that within the month an invitation bearing the royal seal of Aurelia would land on his desk, offering Crawford Logistics International the single largest contract of its history. He had no way of knowing that he was about to mortgage everything he had left: his company, his name, his last shred of credibility, chasing a deal designed piece by careful piece by the very woman he'd discarded like a guest who'd overstayed a party. Ethan Crawford lifted his glass, smiled at the room full of people still murmuring about what they'd just witnessed, and drank to a future he believed was finally, fully his own. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. 3 weeks later, on a private terrace overlooking the capital of Aurelia, Vivian stood in front of a long glass table covered in shipping manifests, loan documents, and bank statements her father's intelligence office had quietly assembled. Every overextended contract, every desperate gamble, every lie Ethan Crawford had told his board, his investors, and the world about the true health of his empire. Gerard stood across from her, a tablet in hand, his expression carefully neutral in the way of a man who has served the royal family long enough to know better than to ask questions his sovereign hasn't invited him to ask. "He's $600 million in debt against assets worth less than half that," Gerard said. 3 failed acquisitions in 2 years, a board that's 1 bad quarter away from forcing him out, and a personal guarantee on the company's largest credit line that means if Crawford Logistics fails, he loses his house, his cars, everything not protected by trust. "And the port project?" Vivian asked, not looking up from the documents. "The selection committee meets in 8 weeks. If we extend the invitation, he'll have no choice but to compete for it. A contract that size could save his company Cecin or finish it, depending on how the bidding process unfolds." Gerard hesitated. "Your Highness, if I may ask, what exactly are you planning to do with this information?" Vivian finally looked up, and there was nothing in her expression that resembled the quiet, unremarkable florist Ethan Crawford had spent 5 years believing he'd married. Her eyes were clear, calm, and utterly without mercy. "I'm going to give him exactly what he always wanted," she said. "A seat at the biggest table in the world." She closed the folder gently, the way she'd once closed the folder he'd slid across her anniversary dinner table. "And then I'm going to let him watch everything he built collapse, in front of every person whose respect he ever cared about." Gerard inclined his head. "I'll prepare the invitation. Make sure it reaches him personally," Vivian said, turning to look out over the terrace at the mountains beyond, the kingdom she had been born to and had once run so far from. "I want him to open it himself. I want him to feel, for just a moment, like the luckiest man alive." Behind her, the wind moved gently through the open doors, carrying with it the scent of the gardens below. Roses, mostly, the same flowers she'd spent 5 quiet years arranging in a shop on the Lower East Side, never once telling the man she loved that she had grown up walking through gardens 10 times the size of his entire company headquarters. She had wanted, once, to be loved simply for herself. Now she wanted something else entirely. And for the first time in years, she let herself want it without apology. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by courier to the glass tower on 11th Avenue that housed Crawford Logistics International, and Curtis was the one who found it sitting on top of the mail tray with a wax seal pressed into heavy cream cardstock, a seal Curtis didn't recognize, an eagle wrapped around a mountain crest, foreign in a way that made him turn it over twice before he carried it into Ethan's office. "This came for you," Curtis said, setting it on the desk. "No return address. Just this seal." Ethan was on the phone with his CFO, a tired man named Walter Hines, who had spent the last 6 months quietly trying to convince Ethan to sell off 2 of the company's smaller subsidiaries before the debt situation became public. Ethan waved Curtis off without looking up, finished the call with a clipped, "We'll discuss it Thursday," and hung up before he finally reached for the envelope. He turned it over once. The seal meant nothing to him. He assumed, vaguely, it was some kind of marketing gimmick, a new client trying to make an impression, the kind of overproduced packaging that consultants sometimes use to get past gatekeepers. He nearly set it aside for Curtis to screen properly. Something about the weight of the paper stopped him. He broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet, the letterhead embossed with the royal crest of the Kingdom of Aurelia, and beneath it, in formal, precise English, an invitation. Crawford Logistics International was being considered, the letter explained, as one of 4 finalists for the development and operation contract of the new Port of Aurelia Maritime Corridor, a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project that would, over the following decade, position the small mountain kingdom as a critical link between European and Asian shipping lanes. The successful bidder would receive exclusive operating rights for 30 years. A formal proposal, along with a refundable deposit demonstrating financial capacity, was required within 6 weeks. Ethan read it twice. Then a third time, slower, his pulse picking up with each pass. He knew about Aurelia, vaguely, a small, wealthy kingdom tucked somewhere in the mountains, one of those places that showed up occasionally in financial press because of its sovereign wealth fund, its absurdly low debt-to-GDP ratio, its reputation for being one of the few European monarchies that still wielded actual governing authority instead of existing as a tourist photo opportunity. He hadn't thought about the place twice in his life. He certainly had never imagined it would be the thing standing between his company and collapse. "Curtis," he said, and his voice had a different texture now, something close to disbelief layered over hunger. "Get Walter back on the phone. Now." Within the hour, Ethan's entire executive floor had gone quiet, in the particular way that offices go quiet when something enormous and unexpected drops into the middle of an ordinary day. Walter Hines stood in Ethan's office with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, scanning the letter for the 3rd time, his expression a careful, professional mask over what was clearly a deep and immediate skepticism. "This is real," Walter said slowly. "I've heard of this project. Aurelia announced it 18 months ago. They've been quietly building out their port infrastructure to compete with the bigger Mediterranean hubs. If this is legitimate, and it looks legitimate, this is the kind of contract that doesn't come along twice in a career." "Then why us?" Ethan asked. He wasn't being modest. He genuinely didn't understand. "We're not even in the top 10 shipping operators globally. We don't have a presence in Europe. Why would a sovereign kingdom invite Crawford Logistics to bid on something this size?" Walter hesitated, and something flickered across his face, the look of a careful man trying to decide whether to voice a concern that might get him fired for insulting his boss's luck. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "But Ethan, I have to say this plainly, because nobody else on this floor is going to. We are $600 million in debt. Our credit lines are stretched thin enough that one more bad quarter puts us in default territory. If this deposit requirement is anywhere near what these projects usually demand, how much usually?" Walter pulled up something on his phone, scrolled, frowned. "For a project this size? Could be anywhere from 40 to 80 million, refundable on completion of the bid process, forfeited if the winning party fails to execute or withdraws after acceptance." He looked up. "Ethan, we don't have $80 million sitting around. We barely have the operating capital to make payroll through the 4th quarter without drawing down the line of credit again." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letterhead, at the crest, at the careful formal language of a document that represented, to him, the single largest opportunity of his professional life, arriving at the exact moment he needed it most. He thought about the board meeting scheduled for next month, the one where 2 members had already privately signaled they intended to raise the possibility of bringing in outside leadership. He thought about the line in the Forbes piece, "The man who moves the world," and how thin that title had started to feel lately, how much it had begun to resemble a costume rather than a fact. "We'll find it," Ethan said. Walter's jaw tightened. "Find $80 million in 6 weeks? I'll mortgage the Hamptons house. I'll take a personal loan against my shares. I'll do whatever it takes." Ethan stood up from his desk, energy moving through him now in a way it hadn't in months. The particular dangerous energy of a desperate man who has just convinced himself that desperation and opportunity are the same thing. "Walter, do you understand what this contract means? 30 years of exclusive operating rights on one of the most strategically positioned ports in Europe. This isn't just a deal. This is the thing that saves the company. This is the thing that makes every bank that's been quietly nervous about our balance sheet forget every number they've seen in the last 2 years. Or it's the thing that finishes us if we don't win, Walter said quietly. Ethan, I need you to actually hear that part. If we put up an $80 million deposit we don't fully have and we lose the bid, we are not in a position to absorb that loss. We would be in serious trouble, the kind of trouble that doesn't have a clean way out. Ethan looked at his CFO for a long moment, and something in his expression closed off, the particular shutting down look of a man who has decided that hearing more caution will only slow him down. I appreciate you saying that, he said, in the tone of a man who did not in fact appreciate it. But I didn't build this company by being afraid of risk. Get the lawyers reviewing this paperwork today? I want our formal letter of intent sent back within 72 hours. 6,000 miles away, in a private study overlooking the eastern gardens of the Aurelian Palace, Vivian sat across from her father for the first time in 3 years. King Alistair von Aurelia was 71 years old, silver-haired, broad through the shoulders despite his age, with the kind of unhurried gravity that came from 40 years of governing a small but fiercely independent country. He had not been angry when his daughter walked out 8 years ago. Disappointed, certainly, worried in the way any father is worried watching a child choose an uncertain path, but never angry. He had understood, more than most fathers in his position would have, exactly what she'd been running from. "You look tired," he said, studying her over the rim of his coffee cup. "I'm fine, Papa." "You're not fine, you're furious. You've simply gotten very good at hiding it." He set the cup down. "Tell me about him." Vivian hadn't told her father much of anything yet. Not the details, not the ballroom, not the way Ethan had slid the divorce papers across the table next to a cake with 5 candles still burning. She told him now plainly, without embellishment, because embellishment had never been necessary. The facts alone were damning enough. When she finished, her father was quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on the gardens outside the window, where 2 of the groundskeepers were trimming back a hedge of white roses that had been planted the year Vivian was born. "And the invitation," he said finally. "It's gone out?" "It went out yesterday. You understand what you're doing, don't you? This isn't simply ending a bad marriage. This is dismantling a man's entire life in front of the world. He humiliated me in front of 200 people, Papa. He told me I wasn't enough to stand beside the empire he was building, while his mistress stood behind him with her hands on his shoulders." Vivian's voice didn't rise, didn't crack. It simply hardened, the way steel hardens under pressure rather than heat. "I'm not interested in petty cruelty. I'm not going to slash his tires or leak photographs to a tabloid. I'm going to let him walk, of his own free will, into exactly the future he chose for himself. He wants an empire built on appearances instead of substance. I'm going to show the entire world what that looks like when it collapses." King Alistair studied his daughter for a long moment, and something that might have been pride, carefully restrained beneath decades of royal composure, moved across his face. "Your grandmother would have liked you very much," he said. "She always said the cruelest revenge a person could take was simply refusing to lower themselves to the level of the person who'd wronged them, and then watching that person destroy themselves entirely on their own." "I'm not doing this for revenge," Vivian said, though even as she said it, she wasn't entirely sure it was true. "I'm doing this because Aurelia needs a port operator who actually understands logistics, who isn't drowning in debt, who won't collapse the moment the contract gets difficult. Crawford Logistics fits the profile we need on paper. What happens to Ethan personally, once the truth of his finances becomes public during the bidding process, is simply a consequence of choices he made long before he ever met me." Her father smiled faintly, the particular dry smile of a man who has negotiated treaties and trade agreements for 4 decades and recognizes elegant deniability when he hears it. "Of course," he said, "purely business." "Purely business," Vivian agreed. "And the selection committee, who's chairing it?" Vivian met her father's eyes steadily. "I am, Chem." The next 6 weeks moved with the strange, compressed urgency of a countdown that only one side of the conflict knew was happening. In New York, Ethan threw himself into the bid preparation with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He pulled engineers off 2 other projects to draft the technical proposal. He flew to Aurelia personally, his first and only visit before the gala, a brief 2-day trip during which he toured the existing port facilities with a delegation of Aurelian officials, none of whom mentioned that the woman chairing the selection committee shared a name and a face with the wife he'd discarded 3 months earlier. He hadn't connected it. There was no reason for him to. Vivian Ashford Crawford and Princess Vivian Adelaide von Aurelia existed in his mind as two entirely separate women because he had never once, in 5 years of marriage, asked his wife enough questions to discover they were the same person. He secured the deposit the way desperate men secure things, by stripping away every cushion he had left. He mortgaged the Hamptons house, the one Vivian had loved and rarely visited because she found the parties his friends threw there exhausting. He took a personal loan against his shares in Crawford Logistics, a move his lawyer warned him repeatedly carried enormous personal risk if the bid failed. He liquidated a retirement account he'd built over 15 years. He sold a vintage car collection he'd spent a decade assembling, each sale a small, almost imperceptible crack in the foundation of the life he'd built, each crack justified in his mind by the size of the prize waiting on the other side. Celine, for her part, watched all of this with the careful, calculating attention of a woman who had attached herself to Ethan precisely because of what his success could offer her, and who was now beginning, in private moments, to feel the first cold edges of worry. "You're putting everything into this," she said one night, watching him work at his desk at 2 a.m, surrounded by spreadsheets and proposal drafts. "What happens if you don't win?" "I'm going to win," Ethan said, not looking up. "Ethan." She came around the desk, perched on the edge of it, forcing him to meet her eyes. "I'm not asking because I doubt you. I'm asking because I want to understand the plan if things go differently than you expect." "There is no other plan." His voice had an edge to it she hadn't heard before, something brittle beneath the confidence. "This contract saves the company. It saves everything. I'm not going to sit here and plan for failure, Celine. That's not how you win anything." She studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression, something calculating, something already quietly preparing an exit strategy of her own, passed across her face before she smoothed it back into reassurance. "Of course," she said, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "I just worry about you." She did not, in fact, worry about him nearly as much as she worried about herself. Vivian, meanwhile, spent those same 6 weeks doing the quiet, exacting work of a woman building a trap with the patience of an architect rather than the heat of someone seeking vengeance. She reviewed every page of Crawford Logistics' proposal personally, alongside the selection committee's financial analysts, watching as the gaps in Ethan's actual capital position became clearer with each passing week. She authorized nothing that wasn't strictly procedural. The committee's process was, on paper, entirely fair, entirely transparent, exactly as rigorous for Crawford Logistics as it was for the 3 other finalists, a German conglomerate, a Singaporean shipping group, and a smaller but financially immaculate Dutch firm that everyone privately assumed would win. That was in fact the most elegant part of her design. She didn't need to rig anything. She didn't need to manufacture a single piece of evidence against him. She simply needed to require, as the committee always required of every bidder, complete financial transparency as a condition of advancing past the preliminary round, audited statements, debt disclosures, proof of the company's actual capacity to execute a 30-year contract without risk of insolvency partway through. Ethan's team, scrambling to meet the deadline, submitted documents that were, in places, deeply and provably misleading. Not outright fraudulent in a way that would have triggered immediate disqualification. Ethan wasn't stupid, and his lawyers weren't sloppy, but optimistic in ways that strained credibility once compared against the public debt filings the committee's own analysts pulled independently. Revenue projections that assumed contracts not yet signed. Debt figures that conveniently excluded 2 of the company's most troubled subsidiaries. A net worth statement for Ethan personally that valued the Hamptons house at a figure 40% above what it had actually sold for in the rushed mortgage process 3 weeks earlier. "He's lying in the disclosures," said Helena Brandt, the committee's lead financial analyst, a sharp-eyed Aurelian German woman who had been reviewing infrastructure bids for the kingdom for over a decade. She slid the comparison documents across the conference table to Vivian. "Not catastrophically, but enough that if this were any other bidder, we'd have disqualified them in the preliminary round." "I know," Vivian said. Helena studied her for a moment. The committee, of course, did not know that Vivian had any personal connection to Ethan Crawford whatsoever, that history had been kept entirely private, scrubbed even from the casual conversations Vivian had with her own staff. As far as anyone on the committee understood, Crawford Logistics was simply one of 4 finalists in a standard, high-stakes infrastructure bid. "Your Highness, if I may ask," Helena said carefully, "why are we keeping a bidder in the process whose financial disclosures don't hold up under basic scrutiny? We have 3 other finalists who are, frankly, far more qualified on paper." Vivian considered her answer carefully before she spoke, because the truth, the real, complicated truth, was not something she could say aloud even to a trusted advisor. "Due process," she said finally. "Every bidder deserves the opportunity to present their full case at the formal proposal stage before any decision is made. We don't disqualify based on preliminary discrepancies alone. We document them. We verify them independently. And then, when the time comes to render a final decision, we make that decision in front of all 4 finalists with full transparency about what our analysis found." She met Helena's eyes. "Crawford Logistics will get exactly the same fair hearing as everyone else. I simply intend to make sure the hearing is thorough." Helena, who had worked in Aurelian government long enough to recognize when a member of the royal family was choosing her words with unusual precision, nodded slowly and said nothing further. She had learned over the years that some decisions were not hers to question. It was during the 4th week of preparation that Marian flew to Aurelia for the first time since she and Vivian had left together 8 years earlier, summoned by a brief, uncharacteristically urgent message from her closest friend. She found Vivian on the terrace overlooking the eastern gardens, the same terrace where Vivian had stood weeks earlier reviewing the first reports on Ethan's debt, except now the table in front of her was covered in something different. Not financial documents, but photographs. Old ones. A wedding photo from 5 years ago, the 2 of them laughing on a beach in the Maldives during their honeymoon, Ethan's arm around her waist, both of them younger, both of them, in that particular photograph, looking genuinely happy in a way that had nothing to do with money or an empire building. "You kept these?" Marian asked, settling into the chair across from her. "I almost threw them away 100 times. Vivian picked up the photograph, studied it for a moment, then set it back down. "I kept telling myself I'd do it eventually. I never did." "Why not?" Vivian was quiet for a long moment, watching the gardeners work below. "Because for about 18 months, in the beginning, I think it was real. I think he genuinely loved the version of me that existed in that flower shop. I think somewhere along the way, the company started eating him alive, and he stopped knowing how to be a person who didn't measure everything by what it could do for his image." She picked up the photograph again, turned it over in her hands. "It doesn't make what he did to me acceptable. It doesn't undo any of it. But I think I needed to understand that I wasn't a fool for loving him, even if loving him turned out to be a mistake." "You're allowed to grieve it, you know," Marian said gently, "even while you're dismantling his entire empire. Those 2 things aren't in conflict." Vivian smiled faintly, though there was real sadness underneath it. "I know. I'm trying to let myself do both." She set the photograph down and pushed it aside, making room on the table for the document Helena had prepared earlier that week. The preliminary financial analysis, the discrepancies, the careful timeline of exactly how exposed Crawford Logistics actually was. "But I won't lie to you, Marian. There's a part of this that does feel like justice. Maybe that makes me smaller than I want to be. I don't particularly care right now." "It doesn't make you smaller," Marian said firmly. "He stood in front of 200 people and told you that you weren't enough to stand beside him. He has no idea what enough actually looks like. I think it's time he found out." The selection committee's formal gala, the event at which the winning bidder would be announced before an audience of international press, foreign dignitaries, and the finalists themselves, was scheduled for the first Saturday in October to be held in the Grand Hall of the Aurelian Palace, a room that had hosted treaty signings and royal weddings for over 300 years. Ethan arrived in Aurelia 3 days early, staying at the kingdom's finest hotel with Celine and a small entourage of executives, behaving, by every account Vivian received from her staff, like a man already certain of victory. He'd given an interview to a regional business journal in which he described Crawford Logistics as uniquely positioned to deliver world-class infrastructure with the agility a smaller, hungrier company can offer that larger conglomerates simply can't match. He toured the existing port facilities a second time, this time with photographers in tow, the images clearly intended for a press release he'd already begun drafting in his head. The one announcing Crawford Logistics International as the winner of the largest contract in the company's history. He had no idea, walking through those gleaming new docks under a gray autumn sky, that the woman who would decide his fate in 3 days' time had once stood beside him on a different shore entirely, in a different life, asking him quietly over breakfast whether he ever thought about slowing down, about building something smaller and steadier instead of something enormous and fragile, and that he had laughed at the question, kissed her forehead, and told her she didn't understand how the real world worked. The night before the gala, Vivian sat alone in her private study, the final committee report open on the desk in front of her. Every finalist's full financial picture, verified now beyond dispute, laid out in clean, devastating clarity. The German conglomerate, financially sound but logistically overextended in 3 other regions. The Singaporean group, strong on paper but politically complicated given recent trade tensions. The Dutch firm, immaculate, conservative, almost certainly the safest choice on every metric that mattered. And Crawford Logistics International. $640 million in verified debt against assets independently valued at less than half that figure. A personal financial guarantee from its CEO that, if called, would leave him with nothing. No house, no investments, no cushion of any kind. An $80 million deposit, fully collateralized, sitting in an escrow account that would be forfeited entirely, per the committee's standard bidding terms, the moment his proposal was formally rejected. She closed the file and sat in the quiet study for a long time, the lamp casting a small pool of gold light across the desk, the rest of the room dark. She had told her father this wasn't about revenge. She had told Helena it was about due process. She had told Marion it was about justice. And maybe it was all of those things at once, tangled together in a way that didn't resolve neatly no matter how many times she tried to untangle it. But sitting there the night before the gala, looking at the photograph of 2 young people laughing on a beach in the Maldives, the photograph she still hadn't been able to throw away, she allowed herself finally to admit the simplest truth underneath all of it. She wanted him to understand what he'd thrown away. Not the company, not the deposit, her. The version of her that had loved him without reservation, the version he had told in front of 200 witnesses that she wasn't enough. Tomorrow, he would learn exactly how much enough had actually been worth. She picked up her phone and dialed Gerard. "Is everything in place for tomorrow?" she asked. "Everything, Your Highness. The committee's findings will be presented in full before the announcement. The press credentials have been confirmed. Representatives from every major financial outlet in Europe and several from the United States will be in attendance." A brief pause. "And the seating arrangement, as you requested. Mr. Crawford and his delegation have been placed at the second table from the dais, close enough to see everything clearly." "Good." Vivian looked out the window at the dark gardens below, at the faint outline of the mountains beyond the palace walls, silent and ancient and entirely indifferent to the small human drama about to unfold within their shadow. "And the chairwoman's introduction, has that been finalized?" "It has," Gerard said, "exactly as you wrote it." "Then we're ready." She hung up the phone and sat for a moment longer in the lamplight, her hand resting on the closed file in front of her, on the photograph she still hadn't thrown away, on the quiet, complicated weight of everything that was about to happen. Tomorrow, Ethan Crawford would walk into the grand hall of the Aurelian Palace, believing he was about to secure the deal of a lifetime. Tomorrow, he would learn that the woman he'd called not enough had spent her entire life being more than he'd ever bothered to find out. The morning of the gala arrived gray and cold, a thin mist hanging low over the palace gardens, the kind of weather the staff called typical for early October in the mountains. Ethan woke early, restless, the particular jittery energy of a man who has staked everything on a single outcome and has no further moves left to make except wait. "You're pacing," Celine said from the bed, watching him move back and forth across the hotel suite in his undershirt, his phone in hand, scrolling through emails he'd already read a dozen times. "Come back to bed. You need to look rested tonight, not exhausted." "I can't sleep." He stopped at the window, looking out at the gray sky, the mountains barely visible through the mist. Walter called this morning, says 2 of the board members have been asking pointed questions about the deposit, about what happens if we don't win. And what did you tell him? I told him not to worry about it. Ethan turned back into the room, raked a hand through his hair. I told him we're going to win, and once we do, none of those questions matter anymore. Celine sat up, pulling the sheet around her, studying him with an expression that, had Ethan been paying closer attention to anyone but himself, he might have recognized as something closer to calculation than concern. And if you don't win, Ethan, be honest with me. What actually happens? He was quiet for a long moment. When he finally answered, his voice had lost some of its earlier bravado, dropping into something quieter, more honest, the kind of admission he rarely allowed himself even in private. If we don't win, I lose the house. I lose most of my shares. The board will have everything they need to push me out within the quarter. He looked at her directly. But we're going to win. I've seen the other finalist proposals through industry channels. We're competitive on every metric that matters. I have to believe that. You have to believe it, Celine repeated softly, or you've already lost. He didn't answer that. He turned back to the window instead, watching the mist drift slowly across the gardens below, and somewhere beneath the confidence he kept projecting outward, a small, cold thread of doubt had begun, for the first time in 6 weeks, to unspool quietly in his chest. He told himself it was just nerves. He had no way of knowing that the doubt was, in fact, the only honest instinct he'd had in months. By 7 that evening, the grand hall of the Aurelian Palace had filled with nearly 400 guests, finalist delegations, foreign dignitaries, members of the Aurelian government, and a dense cluster of international press positioned along the back wall, cameras already trained on the dais where the formal announcement would take place. Ethan arrived in a tailored black suit, Celine beside him in deep emerald, both of them moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of people accustomed to rooms like this one. Though Ethan's smile, if anyone had looked closely enough, carried a slight tightness at the edges that hadn't been there in the photographs from his earlier visits. He was seated, as instructed, at the second table from the dais. Close enough to see everything clearly, though he didn't think much of the placement at the time, simply assumed it reflected Crawford Logistics' standing among the finalists. He shook hands with the representatives from the German conglomerate, exchanged polite, competitive small talk with the Dutch delegation, accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, and settled into his chair with the particular forced calm of a man trying very hard to look like he wasn't holding his breath. At 8 o'clock, the lights in the grand hall dimmed slightly, and a hush moved through the room as a tall, formally dressed man, Gerard, though Ethan had no reason to know his name, stepped up to a podium near the dais. "Distinguished guests," Gerard began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's careful acoustics. "On behalf of the Kingdom of Aurelia, thank you for joining us this evening for the formal selection announcement of the Port of Aurelia Maritime Corridor Project. Before we proceed to the announcement, I have the honor of introducing the chairwoman of the selection committee, who will present the committee's findings in full." Ethan reached for his champagne glass, only half listening, his attention drifting toward the dais, where a tall doubled-paneled door at the rear of the hall had begun, slowly, to open. "Her Royal Highness," Gerard continued, "Crown Princess Vivian Adelaide von Aurelia." For one full second, the name didn't register at all. Ethan's hand froze halfway to his mouth, the champagne glass suspended, his mind running through the syllables the way a man runs through a phrase in a language he doesn't quite speak, searching for meaning that should have been obvious and somehow wasn't. Then she stepped through the doors, and the room rose to its feet in a wave of formal applause, and Ethan Crawford watched the woman he had handed divorce papers to 3 months earlier, the quiet florist, the woman he had called not enough in front of 200 witnesses, walk across the grand hall of the Aurelian Palace in a gown the color of deep wine, her dark hair swept back from her face, a thin circlet of gold resting against her brow, every step carrying the unmistakable, unhurried authority of someone who had been raised from birth to command exactly this kind of room. His champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the marble floor. The sound cracked through the hall's polite applause like a gunshot, and 400 heads turned toward the second table from the dais, where Ethan Crawford sat frozen, his face draining of color, staring at the woman now taking her place at the podium with the calm, settled grace of someone who had been waiting a very long time for exactly this moment. Celine's hand found his arm, her voice a sharp, urgent whisper. Ethan, what is it? Do you know her? He didn't answer. He couldn't. He sat there in the gathering silence, surrounded by waiters quietly sweeping up broken glass, by murmuring delegates, by the steady, unblinking eyes of international cameras already swinging toward his table, and watched as the woman he had thrown away looked out across the grand hall, found his face in the crowd, and held his gaze for one long, unhurried moment before she finally began to speak. "Good evening," Vivian said, and her voice carried through the grand hall with a calm that felt to Ethan like something physical pressing against his chest. "Thank you for joining us for what I expect will be a memorable evening." A ripple of polite laughter moved through the crowd, the kind reserved for hosts at formal events, the audience reading nothing yet into the words beyond ordinary graciousness. Only Ethan understood the laughter wasn't ordinary at all. Only Ethan, sitting frozen at the second table with broken glass still being swept from beneath his chair, understood that the woman at the podium had just promised the room a show, and that he was about to be the one performing in it. 6 weeks ago, Vivian continued, this committee extended invitations to 4 finalists for the Port of Aurelia Maritime Corridor project, a contract that will define the economic future of this kingdom for the next 30 years. I want to begin by thanking all 4 companies for the extraordinary effort their teams put into this process. Infrastructure projects of this scale demand more than ambition. They demand discipline, transparency, and the financial integrity to deliver on promises made under enormous public scrutiny. She paused, her eyes moving across the room, to the German delegation, to the Singaporean group, to the Dutch table, each acknowledgement brief and professional. When her gaze reached the second table, it lingered a half-second longer than the others, long enough that several people near Ethan noticed, though none of them understood why. Before announcing our decision, I want to walk this room through the committee's evaluation process, Vivian said. Not because transparency is required of us, though it is, but because I believe the people of Aurelia and the international community watching this contract deserve to understand exactly how a decision of this magnitude gets made. Walter Hines, seated 2 chairs down from Ethan, leaned slightly toward him. "This is unusual," he murmured. "Most committees just announce the winner. They don't walk through the evaluation publicly." Ethan didn't answer. He was still staring at the podium, still trying to reconcile the woman standing there with the woman who had arranged flowers in a cramped shop 6 blocks from his old apartment, who had once cried during a movie about a dog, who had made him soup with her own hands the one time he'd had the flu and refused to see a doctor. He kept waiting for the resemblance to dissolve into coincidence. It didn't. The committee evaluated each finalist across 4 primary categories, Vivian said, and behind her a large screen descended silently from the ceiling, illuminating with a clean, simple graphic. 4 company logos, 4 columns of data waiting to populate. Technical capacity, operational experience, strategic alignment with the kingdom's long-term port development goals, and financial integrity. The screen filled in, column by column, as she spoke, figures, ratios, summary scores for each finalist, presented with the dry precision of a board meeting rather than the triumphant flourish of an awards ceremony. The German conglomerate's numbers appeared first, strong across nearly every category except a flagged concern about overextension in 2 other active projects. The Singaporean group followed, solid technically. Weaker on the strategic alignment score given recent diplomatic friction. The Dutch firm's column populated next, clean and nearly unbroken, the kind of numbers that made seasoned financial journalists in the back of the room start quietly typing on their phones, already drafting predictions. Then the 4th column appeared, Crawford Logistics International. Ethan felt his stomach drop before he even read the numbers, because he understood, watching Vivian's face, that whatever appeared on that screen had been chosen deliberately, presented in this specific order, for this specific moment. Crawford Logistics International submitted a technically competent proposal, Vivian said, her tone even, professional, betraying nothing of what lay underneath it. Their operational experience, while more limited in scope than our other finalists, demonstrated genuine creativity in their approach to corridor management. On paper, in the early stages of our process, they were a credible and even compelling candidate. For one brief, dizzying second, hope flickered through Ethan's chest. Maybe this was simply how the process worked. Maybe she'd praise each company, in turn, before delivering some bureaucratic but ultimately survivable verdict. However, Vivian continued, and the word landed in the room like a held breath finally released. This committee's standard procedure requires full financial transparency from every finalist as a condition of advancing to formal consideration. Audited statements, comprehensive debt disclosures, verified proof of capacity to execute a 30-year contract without risk of insolvency partway through its term. The screen shifted. A new set of figures appeared beside the Crawford Logistics column. Not the numbers Ethan's team had submitted, but a second parallel set independently sourced, the discrepancies between the two highlighted in stark red. Crawford Logistics International disclosed total outstanding debt of approximately $290 million, Vivian said. Our independent financial review, conducted using public filings, audited third-party records, and standard due diligence procedures available to any sovereign investment body, identified verified outstanding debt of $640 million. A murmur moved through the room, low and immediate, heads turning toward the second table where Ethan sat with his face draining slowly to gray. Celine's grip on his arm had tightened to the point of pain, though Ethan barely registered it. Crawford Logistics International valued its CEO's personal real estate holdings, offered as part of the collateral supporting their deposit, at $14 million. Vivian continued, her voice never once rising, never once carrying anything that could be mistaken for cruelty, only the flat, devastating weight of fact after fact after fact. That same property sold in a rushed mortgage transaction 6 weeks ago for $8.4 million, a discrepancy our analysts flagged immediately upon review of public county records. This is insane, Ethan said under his breath, half to Walter, half to himself, his hands gripping the edge of the table. How does she have access to Crawford Logistics International's revenue projections for the proposed 30-year contract period? Vivian went on. Assume completion of 3 additional shipping contracts that, according to public records and direct confirmation from the counterparties involved, have not been signed and in 2 cases have been formally declined. Walter Hines had gone very still beside him, his face a careful, professional blank that didn't quite manage to hide the horror underneath it. He had warned Ethan weeks ago about exactly this kind of exposure. He hadn't imagined it would happen in front of 400 people and a wall of international cameras. In total, Vivian said, the discrepancies between Crawford Logistics International's submitted financial disclosures and this committee's independently verified findings amount to approximately $350 million, a gap large enough that, had it been identified during our preliminary screening, would have resulted in immediate disqualification under standard procedure. She paused. The room had gone almost entirely silent now, the kind of silence that has weight, that presses against the chest, broken only by the faint, distant clicking of camera shutters along the back wall. It was not identified during preliminary screening, Vivian said, because Crawford Logistics International structured its disclosures specifically to obscure these figures from routine review. This committee only uncovered the full picture through deeper independent verification conducted over the past several weeks. Ethan was on his feet before he fully understood he'd stood up, his chair scraping back hard against the marble floor, the sound cutting sharply through the silence. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice carrying further than he intended, sharp with panic dressed up as outrage. "I don't know what kind of personal vendetta is happening here, but these figures are being deliberately misrepresented. Mr. Crawford," Vivian's voice cut across the room, calm and absolutely unyielding, and something in the way she said his name, flat, formal, utterly without warmth, made the hair on the back of his neck rise. "You are welcome to dispute any figure presented this evening through the formal appeals process outlined in your bidding agreement. I would encourage you to review the documentation closely before doing so. Every figure on this screen has been independently sourced and cross-verified by 3 separate financial institutions, none of which have any relationship with the Aurelian crown beyond this committee's standard due diligence contracts. "I want to know who's behind this," Ethan said, and now the desperation was fully visible, raw and ugly under the gala lights. The carefully constructed image of the man who moves the world dissolving in real time in front of every camera in the room. "I want to know why my company is being singled out." "You are not being singled out, Mr. Crawford." Vivian's eyes met his fully now, steady and clear, and there was something in them that finally broke through the panic clouding his mind, something achingly, devastatingly familiar that he had looked at across a breakfast table for 5 years and never once truly seen. Every finalist in this process was held to the exact same standard of financial transparency. 3 of the 4 met it without exception. You did not. The room had gone utterly still. The press along the back wall no longer even pretending to write notes, simply watching, recording, every camera trained on the unfolding collapse of a man who, 90 minutes earlier, had walked into this hall expecting to be crowned. Vivian. Her name left his mouth before he could stop it. Quiet, stunned, the formal address abandoned entirely. Several heads near the dais turned sharply at the use of her first name, the unmistakable familiarity of it. Are you? Crawford Logistics International's proposal is rejected, Vivian said, her voice never wavering, never once acknowledging the question he hadn't been able to finish. Per the terms of the bidding agreement signed by Mr. Crawford on behalf of his company 6 weeks ago, the $80 million deposit submitted to secure consideration in this process is hereby forfeited to the Kingdom of Aurelia, effective immediately, due to material misrepresentation of financial disclosures during the formal bidding period. A collective intake of breath moved through the room. Even the journalists, accustomed to corporate collapses and public humiliations, seemed momentarily stunned by the scale of what they were witnessing. $1 billion contract, an $80 million deposit, and a man's entire public reputation, dismantled in the span of 4 minutes by a woman speaking in a voice that never once rose above conversational. "This cannot be legal," Ethan said, though the fight had already started draining out of his voice, replaced by something closer to disbelief. "You can't just—" Mr. Crawford signed a bidding agreement that he had ample opportunity to review with legal counsel, Vivian said. Section 14, subsection 3, states explicitly that material misrepresentation of financial disclosures during the bidding period constitutes immediate grounds for disqualification and forfeiture of deposit. Your legal team reviewed and approved this agreement before submission. I would encourage you to consult them regarding the specific language, since it appears you may not have read it as closely as you should have. The line landed with surgical precision, and somewhere in the crowd a journalist let out a short, involuntary laugh before catching himself. Celine had gone pale beside Ethan, her hand slowly releasing its grip on his arm, her eyes darting toward the exits with the particular instinctive calculation of someone already beginning to plan her departure from a sinking situation. Ethan didn't notice. He was still staring at Vivian, still trying to process the impossible math of his quiet, gentle wife, and the woman standing at that podium being the same person. "Why?" he said finally, the word barely audible, more breath than sound. "Why didn't you tell me? Any of it? In 5 years, you never asked," Vivian said, and for the first time all evening, something raw flickered beneath the calm. Not triumph, not cruelty, but something closer to old, settled grief finally given permission to surface. 5 years, Ethan. You never once asked me where I came from before I was the woman arranging flowers in a shop you barely visited. You never asked why I never talked about family at holidays, why I never invited anyone from my past to our wedding, why I flinched every time a stranger looked at me too long in public. You built an entire marriage around a version of me you found convenient, and you never once wondered what you might be missing. That's not— Ethan's voice cracked. "Vivian, that's not fair. You chose not to tell me." "I chose not to tell you," she agreed, "because for the first 18 months, I thought I had finally found someone who loved me for myself instead of what I could offer him. I was wrong about that, Ethan. I understand that now. But don't stand in this room and pretend my silence is the reason our marriage failed. Our marriage failed the night you decided I wasn't worth the effort of understanding, long before either of us ever stood in front of 200 people at our anniversary dinner." The hall was utterly silent now, 400 people watching a private grief play out in devastatingly public terms, the cameras along the back wall capturing every second of it for broadcast across financial networks within the hour. "This committee's decision is final," Vivian said, turning back to address the room at large, her voice steadying back into its earlier formal cadence, though something in it had changed, some private door now visibly closed. "The Port of Aurelia Maritime Corridor contract will be awarded to the remaining qualified finalist following final committee review, to be announced within 72 hours. I want to thank the German, Singaporean, and Dutch delegations for their patience, professionalism, and integrity throughout this process." She paused, her eyes finding Ethan's one last time across the silent hall. "Mr. Crawford," she said quietly, "security will escort you and your delegation from the premises. I'd suggest you contact your legal counsel before speaking publicly about tonight's findings." Two uniformed palace guards, who had been standing quietly near the side entrances for the entire evening, stepped forward now, moving toward the second table with calm, unhurried purpose. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, his mind still trying and failing to fully process the scope of what had just happened, before Walter Hines gripped his arm. "Ethan," Walter said quietly, urgently, "we need to go. Now. Before this gets any worse." Ethan allowed himself to be moved, his legs functioning on some automatic instinct that had nothing to do with conscious thought, his eyes still fixed on Vivian as the guards escorted him toward the rear doors of the grand hall, past tables of foreign dignitaries who watched him pass with expressions ranging from pity to open fascination, past a wall of cameras still capturing his slow, humiliating exit, past Celine, who had already, he would only realize later, begun edging away from his side, putting careful distance between herself and the man who had just lost everything in front of the entire world. At the doors, he turned back one last time. Vivian was still standing at the podium, watching him go, her expression unreadable, the gold circlet catching the light, the woman he had married and the princess he had never known, fully merged now into a single, devastating image he understood he would carry with him for the rest of his life. "Vivian," he said, his voice barely carrying across the distance, raw in a way it hadn't been since the early days of their marriage, since before the company had eaten away at whatever softness he'd once had. "I'm sorry, I should have—" "Good night, Ethan," she said, and the doors closed behind him before he could finish whatever it was he'd been about to say. The hall erupted into a low, urgent murmur the moment the doors shut. Journalists already typing furiously, delegates leaning toward each other in hushed, scandalized conversation, the entire room buzzing with the particular electric energy that follows any public collapse of someone who had, until minutes earlier, seemed untouchable. Vivian remained at the podium for a moment longer, her hands resting lightly on its edge, her breathing controlled, deliberate, the careful discipline of royal training holding her upright, even as something inside her, old, complicated, not entirely separate from the photograph she still hadn't been able to throw away, quietly, privately broke. She had told herself, walking into this hall tonight, that she felt nothing for him anymore. Standing here now, watching the doors close on the last image she would likely ever have of him, she understood that had never been entirely true. She had felt everything. She simply hadn't let it show. Gerard appeared at her side a moment later, his expression carefully neutral, professional. "The remaining finalists are asking for a brief recess before the formal close of the evening. Shall I arrange refreshments while the room settles?" "Yes," Vivian said. "Thank you, Gerard." "Your Highness." He hesitated, lowering his voice slightly. "If I may, that was extraordinarily difficult to do, and you did it with more grace than most people would have managed in your position." Vivian offered him a faint, tired smile. "It didn't feel graceful." "No," Gerard agreed. "I imagine it never does from the inside." She stepped down from the dais and made her way toward a private antechamber just off the grand hall, where Marian was waiting, having watched the entire proceeding from a discreet table near the rear of the room. Marian rose the moment Vivian entered, crossing the small space in 3 quick steps to pull her into a tight embrace. "You did it," Marion said quietly against her shoulder. "Vivian, you actually did it." "I know. How do you feel?" Vivian was quiet for a long moment, pulling back slightly, smoothing the front of her gown with hands that, now that the cameras were no longer on her, had finally begun to tremble. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "I thought I would feel triumphant. Mostly, I just feel tired." "That's allowed too," Marion said gently. Through the thin walls separating the antechamber from the grand hall, the low hum of 400 guests slowly resuming conversation drifted toward them, the orchestra, silent throughout the announcement, tentatively beginning to play again, the evening reassembling itself around the absence Ethan Crawford had left behind. "There's something else," Vivian said quietly after a moment. "Something I haven't told anyone yet, not even my father." Marion's expression sharpened with concern. "What is it?" "The forfeited deposit, $80 million. Vivian sat down slowly on the edge of a velvet settee, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes distant. "I've already spoken with the Treasury about it. I don't want it absorbed into the general fund. What do you want to do with it?" "I want to start a foundation," Vivian said. "For people who've gone through what I went through, not the royal part, obviously, but the part where someone builds their entire identity around being loved by a person who decides one day that they're not enough. Women, mostly, though not exclusively. People who've been discarded by partners who used money and status as a weapon, who need help rebuilding, legal support, housing, job training, whatever it takes to stand back up on their own." She looked up at Marion. "I want his money to become something that helps people like the version of me that walked out of that ballroom 3 months ago with nothing but a settlement check I refused to take." Marion's eyes filled with sudden tears, and she reached for Vivian's hand, gripping it tightly. "That's beautiful, Vivian. That's exactly the kind of thing you should be doing with this." "It feels strange," Vivian admitted, "using his collapse to build something good. I keep waiting to feel guilty about it." "Don't," Marion said firmly. "He built that collapse himself, with every lie he put in those disclosures, with every choice he made over the last 5 years. You're just choosing not to let his arrogance go to waste." Vivian managed a small, genuine smile at that, the first real one Marion had seen from her all evening. "I'll need a name for it." "You'll think of something." Marion squeezed her hand once more before releasing it. "You always do." Outside the antechamber, the gala continued, the Dutch delegation already being quietly approached by committee officials, the formal announcement of their selection now simply a matter of 72 hours and procedural confirmation. The evening would end eventually, the way most evenings in rooms like this one ended, with champagne, with careful diplomatic conversation, with the slow, steady churn of international business continuing on as it always did, indifferent to the personal catastrophe that had unfolded in its midst. But across the city, in a hotel suite overlooking the same gray mountains Ethan had admired from his window that morning, a very different kind of evening was just beginning. One that would, by the time the sun rose over Aurelia the next day, prove to be only the first of many losses still waiting for him. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat in the hotel suite long after Celine had gone quiet in the next room, long after Walter Hines had stopped calling with updates that amounted to nothing but variations of the same sentence, "We're trying to assess the damage," and stared at the dark window where, somewhere beyond the mist, the palace lights still burned. By morning, the story had already broken across every financial outlet that mattered. Crawford Logistics CEO publicly disqualified over falsified disclosures. $80 million deposit forfeited in Aurelian port. Bid scandal. A photograph of him standing frozen at the second table, champagne shattered at his feet, had already become the image every outlet used to anchor the story. His face caught mid-collapse, captured from 6 different angles by 6 different cameras that had all, it turned out, been waiting for exactly this moment. His phone hadn't stopped vibrating since 5 in the morning. Board members, reporters, a lawyer he hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly eager to offer representation. He ignored all of it, sitting in the gray morning light with his head in his hands, trying to find some version of the last 12 hours that made sense, and finding none. We need to talk about next steps, Walter said, when Ethan finally answered the call at 9. His CFO's voice had the flat, careful quality of a man delivering news he'd already decided couldn't get any worse, only to discover, repeatedly, that it could. The board's called an emergency session for tomorrow morning. Ethan, I have to be honest with you. I don't think there's a version of this where you keep your position. I built that company, Ethan said, his voice hoarse, from the ground up after my father retired. I am not walking away from it because of one bad night. It wasn't one bad night, Walter said quietly. It was $640 million in debt that the entire financial world now knows about, on top of an $80 million deposit we no longer have, on top of a public disqualification for falsifying disclosures broadcast to every major outlet in 3 countries. Ethan, I need you to understand the position we're actually in. This isn't about saving face anymore. This is about whether the company survives the next 90 days. Ethan closed his eyes. What do you need from me? Right now, I need you to not say anything publicly. No statements, no interviews, nothing until legal has a chance to assess our exposure. And Ethan, Walter hesitated. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, because I can't protect you if I don't know the truth. Did you know the disclosures were that far off when you signed off on them? The silence stretched long enough that it became its own answer. I knew the numbers were optimistic, Ethan said finally. I didn't think anyone would dig deep enough to catch the gap. Walter exhaled slowly on the other end of the line, a sound that carried more disappointment than anger. Then I need you to prepare yourself for what comes next. Because if Aurelia's committee found this in 6 weeks, regulators are going to find it too, once this story has enough oxygen. And falsifying financial disclosures to secure a deposit-based bid isn't just a business failure, Ethan. Depending on how the SEC and the international authorities want to characterize it, that's potentially fraud. He tried calling a lawyer that afternoon, not the corporate counsel who'd reviewed the bid agreement, but a divorce attorney, the one who'd drafted the papers Vivian had signed without complaint 3 months earlier. He sat in his hotel suite with his laptop open, scrolling through the language of the agreement he'd had drafted in such a hurry, looking for some lever, some clause, anything that might let him reach what remained of Vivian's fortune now that the world understood exactly who she was. I need you to look at something, he said, when the attorney, a sharp, expensive man named Philip Garner, finally picked up. The divorce agreement. The one I had you draft for Vivian Crawford. I remember it, Garner said. Why? Turns out my wife is the crown princess of Aurelia. Ethan said it flatly, the absurdity of the sentence still not fully real to him even as it left his mouth. I need to know if there's any path to reopening the settlement. Spousal claim, asset disclosure fraud, anything. She had a level of wealth she never told me about during our entire marriage. That has to mean something. There was a long pause on the line. Ethan, Garner said carefully, I drafted that agreement at your specific instruction. Do you remember what you told me to put in it? Just get me out clean, standard terms. No, Garner said. You told me to make it airtight. You said, and I'm quoting you directly because I remember the conversation distinctly, I don't want her lawyers coming back at me in 5 years for half my company. Make sure she has no claim on anything I build going forward, and make sure I have no claim on anything that's hers, regardless of what either of us discovers later. You were thinking about protecting Crawford Logistics from a future claim, Ethan. You wanted total separation immediately, with no lingering entanglements. I drafted exactly what you asked for. Ethan's stomach dropped. There has to be something. A loophole, fraud in the inducement, failure to disclose material assets. There isn't, Garner said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. I've already pulled the agreement this morning, the moment I saw the news. Section 9, the mutual waiver clause. It's broad, Ethan, broader than almost anything I've drafted in 15 years of practice, because you specifically asked for breadth. Both parties waive any claim, present or future, to assets undisclosed at the time of signing, regardless of subsequent discovery. You wrote your wife a blank check to walk away with everything she had, and in exchange she signed away any claim to what you built. The clause cuts both directions. It always did. You just never imagined it would cut against you. This can't be right, Ethan said, though even as the words left him, he understood with a sick, sinking clarity exactly how right it was. He drafted that clause out of arrogance, certain in the moment that Vivian had nothing to hide, that the only assets in question would ever be his, that the agreement existed purely to protect him from a woman he'd assumed had no leverage at all. "I'm sorry, Ethan," Garner said, and for the first time in the conversation, something that resembled genuine sympathy entered his voice. "I'll review every angle, but I want to manage your expectations honestly. The agreement is exactly what you asked me to build. There's no claim here. Princess Vivian von Aurelia owes Crawford Logistics International nothing. And frankly, given what's emerging in the press about your disclosures, I'd encourage you to focus your legal resources elsewhere. You have bigger problems coming." Ethan hung up the phone and sat motionless in the hotel suite for a long time, the gray Aurelian light filtering weakly through the curtains, the document on his laptop screen, the agreement he'd rushed to draft 3 months ago in the satisfied afterglow of a divorce he'd believed cost him nothing, staring back at him like a verdict he'd written himself and only now learned to read. The bigger problems arrived 2 days later, in the form of 4 investigators from the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, accompanied by a representative from an international financial crimes task force. Standing in the lobby of Crawford Logistics International's 11th Avenue headquarters, with a warrant authorizing the seizure of financial records dating back 3 years, Curtis was the one who called Ethan, his voice cracking with panic. "They're here, Mr. Crawford. They're here right now. They have a warrant. They're already in Walter's office." Ethan had flown back to New York the previous night, Celine noticeably absent from the seat beside him on the return flight, having quietly informed him at the Aurelian Hotel that she needed some time to think, a phrase that, even in his exhausted, shattered state, Ethan understood well enough to recognize as the opening line of a much longer goodbye. He arrived at the office 40 minutes after Curtis's call to find the floor in a state of barely controlled chaos. Employees clustered in doorways, watching investigators move through file cabinets and server rooms with the calm, methodical efficiency of people who had done this many times before. Walter Hines stood near his own office, ashen-faced, watching 2 agents carry out boxes of financial records he'd spent the better part of a decade carefully assembling. "What is this?" Ethan demanded, pushing through the floor toward the lead investigator, a composed woman in a gray suit who introduced herself as Agent Donna Reyes. "Mr. Crawford, we have a warrant authorizing review of Crawford Logistics International's financial disclosures, dating back 3 years, in connection with a formal investigation into potential securities fraud and falsification of financial records submitted in connection with an international infrastructure bid." She handed him a folded document. "Your legal counsel has already been notified. I'd recommend you cooperate fully and direct further questions to them." "This is insane," Ethan said, his voice rising despite himself, aware of every employee on the floor watching this unfold, aware of how thoroughly his entire professional life was now dissolving in front of the same people who, 6 months ago, had treated him with the careful deference reserved for a man who controlled their paychecks. "I haven't been charged with anything. Not yet," Agent Reyes said evenly. "This is a financial review, Mr. Crawford. Charges, if warranted, will follow standard procedure. I'd strongly advise you to have counsel present for any further conversation." He spent the rest of that day in his office with the door closed, watching through the glass wall as investigators moved through the floor he'd built, the company his father had started with 3 trucks. 50 years earlier, reduced now to a crime scene populated by people in gray suits carrying out boxes labeled with case numbers instead of project names. His phone buzzed. A text from Celine, the first communication since the airport. "I need some space to figure things out. I think it's better if we don't see each other for a while." He stared at the message for a long time before he set the phone face down on his desk and didn't pick it up again that day. The board meeting convened the following morning in the same conference room where, 18 months earlier, Ethan had unveiled his expansion strategy to enthusiastic applause, where he'd stood at the head of the table describing Crawford Logistics International's future with the easy, expansive confidence of a man who had never once doubted he'd get there. He sat now at that same table, flanked by a defense attorney Walter had insisted he retain before the meeting even began, and watched as 11 board members, several of whom he'd personally recruited, several of whom had attended his anniversary party 3 months ago and watched in stunned silence as he'd handed his wife divorce papers in front of 200 witnesses, reviewed a presentation Walter had assembled outlining the full scope of the company's exposure. "The federal investigation alone puts us in an untenable position with our existing lenders," said Margaret Calloway, the board's longest-serving member, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had served on the board since Ethan's father had run the company. "3 of our 4 major credit lines include clauses allowing immediate recall in the event of a pending securities investigation. We received notice from 2 of those lenders this morning. They're calling the loans." "Calling them?" Ethan repeated. "Now? Without warning?" "They gave us 30 days, Margaret said, which, given that we don't have anywhere near the liquidity to cover even one of those balances, effectively means we're insolvent within the month unless we find emergency financing, restructure the debt entirely, or sell off enough of the company's assets to cover the recall." She looked at him directly, her expression unreadable. "Ethan, I've sat on this board for 22 years. I watched your father build this company from nothing, and I've watched you run it for the last decade with genuine respect for your instincts, even when I disagreed with your strategy. But I have to say this plainly, because someone needs to. The board does not have confidence that you can lead this company through what's coming next." The room went very quiet. Ethan looked around the table at faces he'd known for years, some who'd been at his wedding, some who'd celebrated his 40th birthday with him at a restaurant he could no longer afford to set foot in, and saw in each of them the same careful, distant expression of people preparing to cut their losses. "What are you proposing?" Ethan asked, though he already knew. "A formal vote of no confidence," Margaret said, "effective immediately, removing you as CEO, pending the outcome of the federal investigation. The board will appoint an interim leadership team to manage the company through restructuring, and depending on the investigation's findings, we'll determine whether a permanent change in leadership is necessary going forward." "You can't do this," Ethan said, though the words had no real force behind them anymore. The fight drained out of him over the course of a week that had stripped away, one piece at a time, every certainty he'd built his identity around. Your father founded this company," Margaret said, not unkindly, but without flinching either. "You built a great deal on top of what he started, and for a long time you built it well. But the choices that led us here, the disclosures, the deposit, the personal guarantee you put against assets that turned out to be worth half what you claimed, those were your choices, Ethan, made without board oversight, made in pursuit of a deal you wanted so badly you stopped being careful about how you got it." She paused. "I'm sorry. I genuinely am, but the vote is happening this morning, with or without your participation." The vote took 11 minutes. Ethan sat through all of it in silence, his attorney occasionally leaning over to murmur something about preserving his position for future litigation, none of which registered as anything more than distant noise. When Margaret read the final tally, 9 in favor of removal, 2 abstaining, none opposed, Ethan didn't argue. He simply nodded once, gathered the folder in front of him that he hadn't opened the entire meeting, and walked out of the conference room that had been, for 10 years, the center of his entire professional identity. So, the arrest came 11 days later. He was at his apartment, not the Hamptons house, which had already been seized as part of the mortgage default proceedings, but a smaller place in the city he'd kept for years for convenience, now feeling, in the wake of everything else, less like a refuge and more like a holding cell he hadn't yet been formally assigned to. He'd spent most of those 11 days in a kind of suspended numbness, watching the financial press dissect every detail of his collapse, fielding calls from a legal team working around the clock to manage an investigation that grew, with each passing day, more clearly headed toward formal charges. The doorbell rang at 7 in the morning. He opened it to find Agent Reyes again, this time flanked by 2 uniformed officers holding a different kind of document than the warrant from 2 weeks earlier. "Ethan Crawford," she said, "you're under arrest for securities fraud and falsification of financial disclosures in connection with the Aurelian Port infrastructure bid. You have the right to remain silent." He didn't fight it. He didn't argue, didn't demand his lawyer be called before they put the cuffs on, didn't perform the outraged disbelief he might have, weeks earlier, believed himself entitled to. He simply stood in the doorway of his apartment in his undershirt and pajama pants, watching the gray morning light fall across the hallway, and let them lead him out, past neighbors who peered through cracked doors, past a small cluster of photographers who had clearly been tipped off in advance and were already capturing the image that would run on every major financial outlet by noon. Ethan Crawford, the man who once moved the world, being walked to a police car with his hands cuffed behind his back. The arraignment happened 3 days later. He was released on bail. His lawyer had managed, at considerable expense, to keep him out of pretrial detention by arguing flight risk concerns were minimal, given that his passport had already been surrendered and virtually all of his remaining assets were frozen pending the investigation. But the formal charges were now public record, splashed across headlines that no longer bothered with euphemism. Crawford Logistics founder charged with fraud. Disgraced CEO faces up to 20 years. He sat alone in his apartment that night, the charges formally filed, his company gone, his house gone, his reputation dismantled in front of the entire financial world, and reached for his phone to call the one person who, even now, even after everything, he still half expected might answer. Celine didn't pick up. He tried twice more over the following week before he finally understood, with the same slow, sick clarity that had defined every revelation of the last month, that she wasn't going to. It was Walter, oddly, who finally told him the truth. Walter, who despite everything, despite losing his own job in the board's restructuring, despite the entire collapse of a company he'd spent a decade helping build, still called Ethan periodically. Out of some loyalty Ethan didn't feel he'd earned anymore. "She's seen someone else," Walter said quietly, during one of those calls, his voice carrying the particular discomfort of a man delivering news he wished someone else were delivering instead. "I heard it from one of the old executive assistants, some hedge fund manager. She's been with him for about 2 weeks now." 2 weeks? Ethan repeated. "That's barely after—" "I know," Walter said. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I know that's not what you wanted to hear." Ethan sat with the phone pressed to his ear for a long moment, staring at the small apartment around him. The apartment that, within another month, his lawyers would inform him also needed to be liquidated to help cover legal fees and a fraction of the outstanding debt the bankruptcy proceedings hadn't yet absorbed, and felt something settle in his chest that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger, something closer to the particular hollow clarity of a man finally seeing the full shape of what he'd built his life around. He had spent 5 years with a woman who loved him without condition, who had hidden an entire kingdom's worth of wealth and status because she wanted simply to be loved for herself. And he had thrown her away because he'd decided she wasn't enough to stand beside the empire he was building. He had spent 8 months with a woman who had never once loved anything about him beyond what his success could provide her. And the moment that success collapsed, she had vanished within 2 weeks, already warming herself against someone else's fortune. "Walter," he said quietly, "did I ever actually know either of them? At all?" Walter was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. "I don't think that's a question I can answer for you, Ethan," he said finally. "I think that's one you're going to have to sit with on your own." Quote, the Crawford Logistics bankruptcy filing went public 6 weeks after the gala. The company's remaining assets sold off in pieces to competitors who had, until recently, considered Crawford a serious rival. The warehouses in Newark, the shipping contracts that remained viable, even the corporate headquarters on 11th Avenue, auctioned to a logistics firm that had been quietly circling Crawford's market share for years, waiting for exactly this kind of opening. Ethan watched the liquidation from a distance, through news coverage and the occasional, increasingly reluctant call from Walter, who had taken a position at a smaller firm and seemed, each time they spoke, more eager to put the entire episode behind him. The company his father had built from 3 trucks and a single warehouse, the company Ethan had spent 10 years expanding into something he believed would outlast him, ceased to exist in any meaningful form by the time the calendar turned to December. Its name, its contracts, its decades of accumulated reputation, absorbed and dissolved into the operations of companies that had simply been more careful, more honest, more willing to grow slowly, instead of chasing the kind of single, glittering deal that had ultimately destroyed everything. The criminal trial was still pending, his lawyers working toward a plea arrangement that would likely, given the scope of the fraud and his cooperation with the ongoing investigation, result in a reduced but still substantial prison sentence. He spent the weeks leading up to his formal plea hearing in a small rented apartment in Queens, a neighborhood he'd never once visited during the decade he'd spent building an empire 6 miles away, surrounded by the particular silence of a life that had, in the span of 2 months, lost every single person who had once populated it. No board members called. No old business associates reached out. The investors who had once competed for invitations to his parties now declined to return his calls, their assistants offering the same polite, distant excuses week after week. Even Curtis, his loyal assistant of 6 years, had finally stopped answering after Ethan had called him, in a moment of particular desperation, asking if there was any way back into the industry, any door still open anywhere. "I'm sorry, Mr. Crawford," Curtis had said, his voice careful, almost gentle, the voice of someone delivering a kindness wrapped around bad news. "I think it's better if we don't stay in touch for a while. I hope you understand." He understood. That was perhaps the cruelest part of all of it. He understood completely because he would have made the same calculation himself, once, in the version of his life where he still had something to protect. It was during one of those long, silent evenings in the Queen's apartment, the city outside his window humming with the same indifferent rhythm it always had, that Ethan finally opened the box of old photographs he'd salvaged, almost reflexively, before the Hamptons' house was seized. Photographs he hadn't looked at in months. Photographs of a marriage he'd ended in front of 200 people without once stopping to consider what he might be throwing away. He found the one from the Maldives, the two of them laughing on a beach during their honeymoon, Vivian's head tilted back, her smile unguarded in a way he hadn't seen in years before the divorce, in a way he now understood he'd stopped noticing was missing from their marriage long before he'd ever signed the papers that ended it. He sat with that photograph for a long time, in the small, quiet apartment that was all he had left, and finally, for the first time since the night of the gala, allowed himself to cry. Not for the company, not for the money, not even for the freedom. He understood he was likely to lose within the year, but for the simple, devastating recognition that somewhere in those 5 years, he had been handed something rare and real, and had been too consumed by ambition to recognize it until it was already gone. Across an ocean, in a palace overlooking mountains he had once admired through a hotel window without understanding what they meant, Vivian Ashford von Aurelia was, at that same hour, sitting in her own quiet study, looking at her own copy of that same photograph, allowing herself the same complicated grief, though hers, unlike his, came with something his never would. Hers came with the clean, settled knowledge that she had not destroyed herself to get there. She had simply, finally, stopped letting someone else decide what she was worth. Spring came late to Aurelia that year, the snow lingering in the higher passes well into April. But by the time the gardens beneath the palace terrace had begun pushing up their first stubborn rows of crocuses, Vivian had already signed the founding charter for what she'd decided to call the Ashford Foundation, keeping, deliberately, the name she'd worn during her years as an ordinary woman, the name that belonged to the version of herself who had once believed love could exist without conditions attached. The $80 million sat at the foundation's core, supplemented within the first few months by contributions from members of the Aurelian business community who had read about its mission in the financial press that had once been so consumed by Ethan's downfall and had since moved on to other scandals, other collapses, the way the press always did. The foundation's purpose was simple, stated plainly on the first page of its charter: to provide legal support, housing assistance, job training, and financial counseling to people, most of them women, though the doors were open to anyone, who had been left with nothing after a partner used wealth and status as a means of control rather than care. "You've had over 300 applications in the first quarter alone," Helena Brandt said, reviewing the intake numbers during one of the foundation's early board meetings, held in a converted wing of the palace's eastern annex that Vivian had insisted on using rather than building something grander and more expensive. "That's far beyond what we projected." "It tells you something, doesn't it?" Vivian said quietly. "How many people are out there living some version of what I lived? Quietly. Without anyone noticing until it's too late. She threw herself into the work with the same exacting attention she'd once brought to flower arrangements in a shop 6 blocks from an apartment she no longer thought about often, reviewing case files personally in the early months, sitting in on intake interviews when her schedule allowed, insisting that the foundation staff treat every applicant not as a charity case, but as someone deserving of the same dignity she herself had once been denied across a dinner table on her own anniversary. There was a woman in the second cohort, a former architect named Renata, who had given up her career to support her husband's political ambitions, only to discover, after 15 years of marriage, that he'd been systematically draining their joint accounts to fund an affair he'd been conducting for nearly half that time. Vivian sat with her personally during the foundation's legal consultation, watching Renata's hand shake as she described the moment she'd found the bank statements, the particular humiliation of realizing how long she'd been lied to without noticing. "I keep asking myself how I missed it," Renata said. 15 years. How does someone miss something like that for 15 years? "You didn't miss it," Vivian said gently. "He hid it. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always feel that way." She reached across the table, not touching, simply present. "It's not your job to have caught a lie someone worked very hard to tell. It's only your job now to decide what you build next." Renata left that meeting with a legal team prepared to fight for her share of assets her husband had tried to bury in offshore accounts, with a temporary housing arrangement that didn't require her to choose between dignity and shelter, and with something Vivian recognized in her own reflection some mornings: the slow, uneven beginning of a person learning to stand back up. It became, over the following year, the work that gave Vivian's days their shape and meaning in a way that the formal duties of her royal title, the ribbon cuttings, the state dinners, the careful diplomatic choreography that had once defined her sense of purpose before she'd ever left for New York, never quite had. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the title she cared most about wasn't princess, wasn't chairwoman of any selection committee, but simply the quiet, unofficial one the foundation staff had started using behind her back with obvious affection: the woman who actually showed up. She resumed her royal duties gradually, in the months following the gala, stepping into responsibilities her father had carried largely alone since her mother's death a decade earlier: trade negotiations, regional diplomatic visits, the slow, patient work of governing a small kingdom that had managed, against considerable odds, to remain both independent and prosperous in a world that had grown increasingly hostile to both qualities. King Alistair watched his daughter settle into this expanded role with the particular satisfaction of a father who had spent 8 years quietly worrying about a child who disappeared into an ordinary American life, and who now found himself instead watching her become something sharper and steadier than he'd dared hope she'd return as. "You've changed," he told her one evening, the two of them walking through the eastern gardens after a state dinner, the spring air still carrying a faint chill that hadn't yet surrendered fully to summer. "Not into someone different, into more of who you already were." "I think I needed those 8 years," Vivian admitted. "I needed to find out what it felt like to be ordinary, even if it ended badly. I don't think I would have made a good queen if I'd never left." "You'll make an exceptional one," her father said, and there was something in his voice, quiet, certain, entirely without the careful diplomatic hedging he usually reserved even for private conversations, that told her he meant it as more than simple reassurance. "I've been thinking lately about succession planning in a way I haven't allowed myself to think about it before." Vivian stopped walking. "Papa?" "I'm not dying, Vivian. Don't look at me like that." He smiled, though something tired moved beneath it. "I'm 71 years old, and I find myself more interested lately in spending my remaining years advising rather than ruling. I'd like to begin transitioning more formal authority to you over the next several years. Slowly, carefully, but deliberately." She didn't answer immediately, looking out instead at the gardens spreading below them, at the white roses planted the year she was born, at the mountains beyond holding the last of the season's snow. "I left this place because I didn't think I wanted this life," she said finally. "I came back because Ethan humiliated me, and I needed somewhere to stand that he couldn't reach. I'm not sure either of those reasons makes for a very noble origin story for a queen." "Most origin stories aren't noble," her father said. Most of them are simply true. You left because you needed to find yourself outside the expectations placed on you since birth. You came back because someone you trusted broke that trust, and you needed your own ground to stand on. And somewhere in between those two things, you became someone genuinely suited to lead this kingdom. Not because of where you were born, but because of what you chose to do with the years you spent believing you were ordinary. He paused. I don't think that's an ignoble story at all, Vivian. I think it's simply a human one. Oh, the plea hearing took place on a gray Tuesday morning in late winter, in a federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan that Ethan had passed 100 times during his years running Crawford Logistics without once imagining he'd someday stand inside it as a defendant. His lawyer had negotiated, after months of careful maneuvering, a plea arrangement that traded full cooperation with the ongoing investigation. Financial records, testimony regarding the falsified disclosures, identification of which employees had known and which had simply followed instructions without understanding the full scope, for a reduced sentence. 4 years, with the possibility of parole after 2.5, contingent on continued cooperation and the restitution payments he'd be required to make for the rest of his working life, drawn from whatever income he managed to rebuild once he was eventually released. He stood before the judge in a suit that no longer fit quite right, having lost considerable weight over the preceding months, and pleaded guilty to 2 counts of securities fraud, his voice steady enough to get through the formal language but carrying none of the confidence that had once defined every public appearance he'd ever made. Walter Hines was the only person from his old life who attended the hearing, sitting alone in the gallery, watching his former boss accept the consequences of choices Walter had warned him about, repeatedly, in the months leading up to the gala. Afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, Walter approached him briefly, before Ethan was led away to process the formal terms of his sentencing. I wanted you to know I came, Walter said. I'm not sure why. I think some part of me still feels loyal to the man who hired me 12 years ago, even after everything. Thank you, Ethan said quietly, for everything you tried to tell me before. I should have listened. Walter studied him for a moment, something complicated moving across his face. Not quite forgiveness, not quite anger, something closer to the particular sadness of watching someone you'd respected dismantle themselves through choices that had been entirely avoidable. I hope you use whatever time you have ahead of you to actually figure out what happened, Walter said. Not just the financial part, the other part. The part where you had something real and decided it wasn't enough. He didn't wait for a response. He simply nodded once and walked out of the courthouse, leaving Ethan standing alone in the hallway with 2 federal marshals waiting to process the next stage of a life he no longer recognized as his own. Prison gave Ethan something he hadn't expected in the early, brutal weeks of adjustment to a routine stripped of every comfort he'd once taken for granted. It gave him time, vast, unstructured stretches of it, with nothing to fill it but his own thoughts, no phone buzzing with deals to chase, no board to impress, no version of himself to perform for anyone watching. He spent the first several months in a kind of numb survival mode, simply enduring, counting days the way every new inmate counts days before the counting itself starts to feel pointless. It was a counselor at the facility, a quiet, unhurried woman named Dr. Okafor, who ran a weekly group session he'd initially attended only because it got him out of his cell for an hour, who finally pushed him toward the harder work he'd been avoiding since the night of the gala. You talk a lot about what you lost, she observed, during one of their individual sessions several months into his sentence. The company, the house, the money. You haven't once mentioned your marriage except as a footnote to the business story. What's there to say about it? Ethan said, more defensive than he intended. It's over. She's a princess. I'm a felon. There's not exactly a sequel there. I'm not asking you to write a sequel, Dr. Okafor said. I'm asking you why a 5-year marriage to a person you describe, every time you mention her, with more genuine feeling than you've ever once used to describe your company, barely registers as a loss compared to losing a corporation that, by your own account, made you miserable for most of the time you ran it. Ethan didn't have an answer for that, not immediately. It took him several more weeks, several more sessions, circling the question from different angles before he finally found something close to the truth. Because admitting I lost her means admitting I had her, he said finally, quietly, during a session deep into his 2nd year. And if I had her, if what we had was real, the way I think it actually was, at least at the beginning, then I'm the one who threw it away. Not the market, not the board, not bad luck. Me. I chose ambition over the one thing in my life that wasn't built on appearances. He looked down at his hands. It's easier to mourn the company. The company, I can blame on circumstances. Her, I can only blame on myself. That's the first honest thing you've said in 8 months of sessions, Dr. Okafor said, not unkindly. He spent the remainder of his sentence doing the slow, unglamorous work of actually reckoning with that honesty. Not in a way that undid anything, not in a way that earned him anything, but in a way that, by the time his release date finally arrived 2.5 years after his sentencing, had left him a noticeably different man than the one who'd walked into that facility convinced his story was a temporary setback rather than the full, deserved consequence of a life built on the wrong priorities. He was released on a cold morning in early spring with no one waiting for him at the gate. Not Celine, who he'd heard, through the prison's slow grapevine of outdated news, had married her hedge fund manager and moved to Connecticut. Not Walter, who'd sent one final letter wishing him well, but had, understandably, moved on with a life that no longer had room for the complications of staying close to a convicted felon. Not even Curtis, whose last contact had been over a year earlier. A brief, kind note explaining he'd taken a job at a logistics startup and hoped Ethan was doing as well as circumstances allowed. He stood outside the facility gates with a small bag containing everything he owned, looked out at a world that had moved on entirely without him, and began for the first time in his adult life the slow process of building something from genuinely nothing. Not the romanticized nothing his father liked to describe from the early days of 3 trucks and a single warehouse, but actual nothing. No name worth trading on, no fortune to leverage, no easy path back to anything resembling the life he'd once had. He found work, eventually, through a re-entry program connected to the facility, starting as a logistics consultant for a small regional trucking company in New Jersey that didn't care about his history beyond the basic background check required by law, that simply needed someone who understood freight routing and didn't mind starting at the bottom of an industry he'd once dominated from the top. He rented a small apartment, modest in every sense, and lived a quiet life that bore almost no resemblance to the one Forbes had once photographed in front of a container ship beneath the headline calling him the man who moves the world. It was, in its own strange way, the most honest life he'd ever lived. The Ashford Foundation's 3rd anniversary gala, a far simpler affair than the grand event in the Aurelian Palace, held instead in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn that the foundation had purchased and renovated into permanent housing for women rebuilding their lives after leaving controlling or abusive partners, drew a modest crowd of supporters, board members, and a number of the foundation's own success stories, women who had come through its programs and were now, themselves, standing as proof of what the work could accomplish. Vivian gave brief remarks that evening, far simpler than the formal address she'd delivered at the gala in Aurelia 3 years earlier, her voice carrying none of the cold, devastating precision of that night, and instead something warmer, more settled, the voice of a woman who had built something genuinely hers rather than simply dismantled something that had wronged her. "When I started this foundation," she said, standing in front of a modest crowd in a renovated warehouse instead of a palace's grand hall, "I told myself it was simply the responsible thing to do with money that had been forfeited under unusual circumstances. I think, if I'm honest, it took me longer than it should have to admit it was something more personal than that." She looked out at the room, at Renata, now 3 years into a thriving architecture practice she'd rebuilt from scratch, sitting near the front with a confidence Vivian remembered her not yet having the night they'd first met. "I built this because I understood in a way I wish I didn't what it feels like to be told you're not enough by someone whose opinion you'd spent years organizing your entire sense of worth around. And I wanted to build something that told people, more clearly than I think anyone ever told me, that being discarded by someone incapable of recognizing your value was never a verdict on your worth. It was only ever a verdict on theirs." The room applauded warmly, and Marian, standing near the back with the particular pride of someone who had watched her closest friend rebuild an entire life from the wreckage of a single humiliating night, found herself, not for the first time, quietly wiping tears from her eyes. Vivian had not remarried. though she'd dated occasionally over the intervening years. A Aurelian diplomat for a brief stretch, an American architect she'd met through, fittingly, the Foundation's housing initiatives. Neither relationship lasting more than several months before quietly, mutually dissolving. She found each time that she wasn't yet ready, that some part of her was still doing the slow work of learning to trust her own judgment of people again after discovering how thoroughly she'd misjudged the man she'd married at 28. She wasn't in a hurry. That, perhaps, was the clearest sign of how much she'd changed since the night Ethan had slid divorce papers across an anniversary dinner table. She no longer measured her worth or the shape of her future against anyone else's timeline or expectations. She had a kingdom that needed her, a foundation that mattered to her more than she'd ever expected it to, and a life that, while not without its quiet, persistent loneliness on certain evenings, was unmistakably, entirely her own. Ethan saw the news about the Foundation's third anniversary in a brief item buried in the business section of a newspaper he'd picked up at a gas station on his way home from a long shift coordinating freight routes for the New Jersey Trucking Company. A short paragraph noting the Ashford Foundation's continued growth, its expansion into a second facility in Chicago, the brief mention of its founder's ongoing royal duties in Aurelia alongside her philanthropic work. He read it standing at the counter of a diner near his apartment, the kind of place he'd eaten dinner alone in 3 or 4 nights a week for the past year, and felt something move through him that wasn't quite envy and wasn't quite regret. Something closer to a strange, clear-eyed admiration he hadn't expected to feel. She had taken the worst night of her life, a humiliation calculated and public, delivered by a man who'd claimed to love her, and built something that helped hundreds of other people survive their own versions of that same humiliation. He had taken his own collapse, equally public, equally devastating, and spent most of the time since simply surviving it day by day, without yet finding anything resembling the same sense of purpose she'd managed to build from the wreckage. He folded the newspaper and set it down, and for the first time in 3 years, instead of simply mourning what he'd lost, he found himself wondering, with something that felt almost like hope, what it might look like to build something of his own from what remained. Not an empire, not anything that would ever again carry his name across a glossy magazine cover, but something smaller and steadier, something built on the kind of honesty he'd never once practiced during the years he'd spent chasing the version of success that had ultimately destroyed him. He didn't know yet what that would look like. He understood, sitting there in a quiet diner in a life entirely unrecognizable from the one he'd once had, that he had a great deal more reckoning left to do before he'd earn the right to call whatever came next a genuine second chance, rather than simply a slower, quieter continuation of the same mistakes. But for the first time since the night the Aurelian Gala had ended his old life completely, he found himself thinking not about what he'd lost, but about what, however modestly, he might still be capable of building, provided he was finally willing to build it honestly, without an audience to perform for, without a balance sheet to inflate, without ever again mistaking the appearance of a life for the substance of one. In Aurelia, on a quiet evening nearly 4 years after the night her marriage had ended in front of 200 witnesses, Vivian stood once more on the terrace overlooking the eastern gardens, watching the last of the season's light fade behind the mountains. The white roses planted the year of her birth, now grown thick and tangled along the garden wall, blooming with the particular stubborn persistence of things that survive despite every season designed to test them. Her father had formally begun the succession transition that spring, and within another 2 years, Vivian understood, she would carry the full weight of the crown her own grandmother had once worn, the weight she had run from at 26 and returned to carry, eventually, with far more clarity than she'd have managed had she never left at all. She thought occasionally of Ethan, not often, not with the bitterness that had defined those first months after the gala, but with a kind of distant, settled understanding that had taken years to arrive at honestly. She had read, through channels she didn't actively seek out but didn't entirely avoid either, that he'd served his sentence, rebuilt a small, quiet life working in an industry he'd once dominated from a very different height. She found, when she thought of him now, that she didn't wish him further suffering. She had gotten what she needed from that night in the Grand Hall, not his ruin for its own sake, but the simple public confirmation that the version of herself he'd called not enough had in fact always been more than enough, more than he'd ever taken the time to discover. What she'd built since then, The foundation, the slow reclamation of a kingdom she'd once fled. The quiet, hard-won confidence of a woman who no longer needed anyone else's validation to know her own worth, had never really been about him at all, not in the end. It had been about her, about learning, the hard way. That real power had nothing to do with wealth or title or the size of an empire a person could claim to control, and everything to do with the integrity to keep choosing honesty even when cruelty would have been easier. The wisdom to build something good out of something painful instead of simply nursing the pain itself, and the quiet daily courage it took to stand back up fully and without apology after someone who claimed to love you had told you, in front of everyone who mattered, that you weren't enough. She had been enough. She understood that now completely, in a way that no longer required anyone else's recognition to feel true. Below her, in the gardens her grandmother had planted and her mother had tended, and she herself had once played in as a child before she'd ever known the full weight of the name she carried. The roses kept blooming season after season, indifferent to every storm that had tried to break them, rooted deep enough in ground they'd claimed entirely as their own.